Every photograph of the Second World War seems to tell the same story. Steel giants moving through smoke, their silhouettes framed by fire and dust. To the soldier on the ground, they looked immortal, rolling fortresses of empire. The tank became more than a weapon. It became a symbol of modern war itself. Fast, armored, unstoppable. But the truth was far less glorious. Beneath every slab of steel was a compromise, between speed and armor, between firepower and reliability, between dreams and reality. For every tank that reached the front, another lay stranded in a depot, half-assembled or crippled by frozen oil. The myth of the invincible machine was born from propaganda, not from endurance. Take the German Tiger. Its 80mm gun could tear through any Allied armor. Its thick plates shrugged off shells that would have annihilated lesser tanks. To the men who faced it, it was terror incarnate. Yet for every Tiger that fired a shot in anger, many more never reached the front. Its engine overheated, its gearbox shattered, its weight crushed the bridges it tried to cross. In the snows of the Eastern Front, Tigers often died not in combat, but in silence, abandoned, burned, or buried. Across the lines, the Americans fielded the M4 Sherman, faster, lighter, infinitely more common. Crews called it the Ronson after the cigarette lighter, lights every time. It could not match the Tiger in armor or gun, but it could be repaired, replaced, multiplied. 10 Shermans could do what one Tiger could not, keep moving. In the end, the war of tanks was not a duel of monsters, but a test of endurance, of fuel lines, factories, and men who kept machines alive long after they should have stopped. And far from the battlefield, in the quiet of a design bureau, another engineer was about to ask the question no general dared to face. What if the tank was already obsolete? The camera loved them. Propaganda films framed tanks as moving cathedrals of steel, sunlight glinting across their turrets, engines roaring in perfect unison. Columns of armor rumbled through the dust like creatures from a new mythology. They called them Iron Dragons, the proof of a nation's industrial faith. The image was flawless, unstoppable power on the march. But that image was theater. Behind every triumphant reel lay a truth too fragile for film. Tanks were not built for eternity, they were built for a few desperate months of survival. Their victories depended not on courage or design, but on fuel convoys, spare parts, and the mechanics who kept them breathing through the night. In every army, the greatest battle was not against the enemy, but against entropy. Mud was their oldest adversary. In Russia, entire armored columns sank into thawing fields, engines choking on water and clay. In North Africa, sand corroded filters and ground down gears until even the best designs became coffins. Most tanks never died to gunfire. They died to exhaustion, oil leaks, broken tracks, clogged radiators. Yet these deaths were rarely filmed, for they carried no glory. The propaganda machine had no space for silence. It showed tanks cresting hills, not engineers scraping mud from frozen wheels. It sang of armor thickness, not of men collapsing beside stalled engines. And so, a generation came to believe that victory belonged to steel, not to logistics. But hidden within the archives, the war's true record endures. Maintenance logs, field reports, requisition lists written in cold ink. They tell a different story, of machines that outlived their makers, of ideals crushed by mechanical fatigue. The battlefield illusion was not born of deceit, but of need. In total war, hope itself required spectacle. And while the world watched the parade, far from the cameras, a quiet experiment was beginning, one that would reveal how easily illusions can burn. Across the ruins of Europe, 5 illusions would come to define how the modern world remembered the age of armored war. Each was born not from evidence, but from emotion. pride, fear, and the desperate need to make sense of a conflict too vast for memory alone. The first myth was that the Tiger tank was invincible. Its image became legend, a moving fortress feared by every Allied crew. In truth, fewer than 1,400 Tigers were ever built. For every tank that reached the front, another lay idle, broken by the weight of its own engineering. It was a masterpiece of lethality and a monument to over-design. The Tiger's reputation was forged not on its victories, but on the terror it inspired. Fear filled the gaps that numbers could not. The second myth declared that the Sherman was weak. Allied soldiers joked grimly about their death traps, comparing them to paper and fire. Yet the Sherman was never meant to duel Tigers. It was designed for endurance, for the kind of war fought by supply lines and bridges, not duels in forests. It could be repaired in a field, shipped across oceans, produced in tens of thousands. Weakness, in this case, was an illusion measured only by comparison to an enemy built to fail. The third myth told that the Soviets triumphed by sheer numbers. It is true, the Red Army built over 50,000 T-34s, but numbers alone did not carry them from Stalingrad to Berlin. Adaptation did. Soviet engineers stripped the tank to its essentials: sloped armor, wide tracks, ease of repair. The T-34 was not a weapon of quantity, but of pragmatism, a machine built for the front, not the parade. Then came the fourth myth, that Germany led the world in innovation. In reality, innovation without standardization is vanity. The Wehrmacht's arsenal became a museum of one-offs and prototypes, consuming resources faster than they could be replaced. And finally, the most enduring myth of all, that the tank decided the war. The truth is colder. Wars are won by systems, not symbols. Steel may have led the charge, but it was the unseen, fuel, radios, factories, and food that determined who advanced and who starved. Yet even as these myths unraveled, a new idea was taking shape, one that would question whether the tank itself still had a place in the modern battlefield. May 1942, the forests outside Leningrad were still heavy with spring mud when the first Tiger that won rumbled toward the front. To the men watching from the trenches, it looked like the future of war made flesh, a shape so vast it seemed to bend the air around it. The 80mm gun cracked through the stillness, its shell slicing through Soviet armor like paper. Radio operators spoke of it with awe, and within weeks, the myth was born. The Tiger was invincible. Its armor was unmatched, 100 millimeters thick across the front, sloped just enough to shrug off the common shells of the time. Its cannon could destroy a T-34 from over 2 kilometers away. In the field reports that filtered through the German ranks, the Tiger was not just a tank. It was a talisman, proof that German engineering could defy defeat. For the Allies, it became the embodiment of fear, the monster that could not be killed. But inside the machine, the truth was far less glorious. The Tiger was a masterpiece that demanded a miracle to keep moving. Its Maybach engine strained against 57 tons of steel. Its transmission cracked under pressure, its suspension froze in the cold. For every 100 kilometers, it drank half a ton of fuel. To move one Tiger required a fleet of trucks, trains, and mechanics, a small army behind a single tank. It could win duels, yes, but not campaigns. Commanders soon realized that the Tiger's greatest enemy was itself. Mud clogged its tracks, bridges collapsed beneath its weight, and spare parts were almost mythical. In the chaos of retreat, crews often destroyed their own tanks rather than abandon them to capture. Some units lost more Tigers to mechanical failure than to enemy fire. What was meant to be a symbol of dominance became a burden too heavy to bear. Yet in defeat, its legend only grew. Allied soldiers mistook any large German tank for a tiger, multiplying its reputation beyond reason. Newspapers exaggerated its numbers. Propaganda embraced its silhouette as both a menace and an excuse. Whenever Allied forces stalled, commanders blamed tigers ahead. The myth had become more powerful than the machine. The tiger's true weakness was never its armor nor its fuel. It was the illusion of perfection, a belief that brilliance alone could overcome reality. As German factories poured resources into these mechanical giants, another army was perfecting the opposite philosophy, simplicity. And in a field outside Kharkov, a new tank was already proving that endurance, not excellence, would decide the war. They called it the Ronson. "It lights every time," the crews joked, borrowing the slogan from a cigarette lighter. To many, the M4 Sherman seemed like a cruel compromise, a tank too thinly armored, too lightly armed, too often burned alive. Soldiers who faced the German Tigers and Panthers spoke bitterly of its fragility. In letters home, some called it a coffin on tracks. From that fear, the myth was born. The Sherman was a death trap, but beneath the smoke and rumor lay a truth far more complex. The Sherman was never designed to duel the Tiger. It was designed to move, to cross oceans, bridges, and continents. Where the Tiger was a monument, the Sherman was a tool. It could be built by the thousands, shipped in crates, reassembled in days. Its radial engine could run on any fuel. Its parts were interchangeable, its mechanics trained in weeks. It was not glamorous, but it was alive. On the battlefields of North Africa, its simplicity became its strength. German tanks might dominate a single engagement, but when they broke, they stayed broken. The Sherman, by contrast, could be towed, patched, and returned to the line before nightfall. What it lacked in armor, it repaid in endurance. In the desert, under the punishing heat, a working engine was worth more than thick steel. By 1944, as Allied forces landed in Normandy, the Sherman's philosophy was vindicated by scale. More than 50,000 had been built, enough to ensure that no battle depended on a single machine. When one burned, 3 more took its place. It was not invincibility that won ground, it was persistence. German crews often destroyed a dozen Shermans before retreating, yet retreat they did. Numbers became inevitability. Inside, the Sherman offered its crews something the enemy's machines did not: a chance. Its hatches were wide, its interior designed for escape. Many who lived through a tank hit survived because the Sherman's fuel system was deliberately engineered to vent explosions outward. It was a pragmatic mercy, the difference between idealism and empathy. In the end, the Sherman's legacy was not built on armor thickness or gun caliber, but on a simple truth: a tank is only as good as the men who can keep it running. The M4 fought not as an icon, but as an instrument, proof that function, not glory, decides survival. For decades, its crews carried the scars of misunderstanding. They knew what history later confirmed, that victory did not belong to the strongest machine, but to the one that kept moving forward. And while the Allies refined the art of reliability, in the East, another army was building a weapon that would redefine simplicity itself, a tank forged in mud, made for a different kind of war. The T-34 was more than a tank. It was the silhouette of the Eastern Front itself, low, angular, and relentless. When it first appeared in 1941, it stunned the German invaders. Its armor was sloped, deflecting shells that should have destroyed it. Its diesel engine refused to ignite under fire. Its tracks, wide and patient, glided over the same mud that swallowed the Wehrmacht's machines whole. In an instant, the myth of German invincibility met a colder, simpler truth: that the future of mechanized war had just changed sides. Western observers, years later, would call it a steamroller, crude, countless, and expendable. To them, Soviet victory was a matter of numbers. Rivers of steel poured from Ural factories, driven by half-trained crews into the jaws of German guns. But that vision misses the quiet genius of the machine itself. The T-34's greatness was not abundance, it was balance. Every plate, every weld, every angle served a single purpose: to make war sustainable. It was a weapon of survival, not prestige. Its sloped armor reduced weight while doubling protection. Its diesel engine, simple and forgiving, could run on poor fuel. Its gearbox could be repaired in a field with a hammer and a length of wire. In the desperate years after 1941, when Soviet industry fled east beyond the Urals, such simplicity meant salvation. Peasant mechanics, many without formal training, could assemble a T-34 in days. Teenagers learned to drive them after only hours. What the West called quantity was, in truth, the mass production of resilience, yet that resilience was bought in blood. For every tank that survived, others were lost in flames. Crews climbed into machines, still warm from the last men who died in them. There was little ceremony, only the rhythm of necessity. The T-34 was both weapon and grave. Soviet tankers fought with a courage that bordered on fatalism, knowing that victory meant enduring longer than the machine itself. By 1943, when the tide turned at Kursk, over 35,000 T-34s had been produced. Germany could not match such scale, nor the brutal efficiency behind it. What the Tiger sought in perfection, the T-34 achieved through humility. It was war reduced to its essence, cheap, mobile, and good enough to win. The T-34 was not just a triumph of Soviet engineering. It was the embodiment of a nation's will to outlast. It proved that design could serve not the elite, but the collective, a form of mechanical democracy forged in fire and snow. But while the Red Army marched west behind its iron phalanx, in Berlin, a new generation of German engineers gathered around blueprints of a different kind. One last gamble to reclaim mastery of the battlefield. Germany's tanks were built like monuments. Every bolt, every plate, every curve of steel reflected a nation obsessed with craftsmanship. The Panther, the Tiger, and later the King Tiger. Each was designed not merely to fight, but to embody the precision of German industry. To look at them was to see order made mechanical. To drive one, however, was to discover the cost of that perfection. On paper, the Panther was an engineer's dream. Introduced in 1943, it carried the powerful 75mm KWK-42 gun, capable of piercing Allied armor at distances where return fire simply bounced away. Its sloped frontal armor mirrored the Soviet T-34, but with superior materials and welds. Its Maybach engine, when it worked, delivered speed rare for such weight. Yet, when it worked, became the caveat of German design. Early Panthers broke down on their first marches to the front. Engines overheated, final drives shattered, transmissions seized after mere hours of movement. The Tiger II carried the same contradiction. It could destroy a Sherman or T-34 before either closed to firing range, but few Tigers ever reached those duels. Each required a small economy to sustain. Its complex road wheels jammed with mud and froze in winter. It consumed hundreds of liters of fuel for a short advance. When bridges could not hold its 57 tons, Tigers had to wade rivers or be abandoned. Every kilometer was an engineering ordeal disguised as progress. As the war dragged on, the gap between ambition and reality widened. German factories, bombed relentlessly, could no longer meet the meticulous tolerances these machines demanded. Skilled machinists were drafted into the army. Replacement laborers, lacked the training to mill gears that meshed flawlessly. Oil shortages forced substitutions of inferior metals, creating tanks that cracked under their own weight. By 1944, half of Germany's tanks were lost, not in combat, but in transit. Meanwhile, the Allies built differently. American Shermans rolled from assembly lines by the tens of thousands, crude by comparison, but interchangeable. Soviet T-34s were hammered together by workers who sometimes slept beside their welding stations. Where German production slowed to polish, Allied production accelerated through compromise. Their tanks did not need to be perfect. They needed to exist. German commanders knew the truth, but could not escape the myth. Hitler himself intervened in design meetings, demanding more armor, heavier guns, impossible performance. His obsession with superiority turned engineering into ideology. The result was a fleet of machines too delicate for the dirt they were meant to conquer. The lesson was brutal and undeniable. In total war, perfection loses to practicality. The Panther may have been the finest tank of its generation, but a single breakdown stranded it, and 10 working Shermans surrounded it. The Tiger may have symbolized mastery, but mastery cannot cross a bridge that collapses beneath its own pride. By 1945, Germany had built the most advanced tanks in the world, and lost the war anyway. Their brilliance had become a trap, blinding the nation to the simple arithmetic of survival. Precision could not outpace production, elegance could not outrun endurance. In the silence after surrender, the factories lay in ruins. Yet even then, engineers began to sketch again, searching for redemption in the one weapon they still believed could restore balance. What they did not yet know was that the next revolution in warfare would not come from armor at all, but from the air above it. No photograph ever captured them. No medals bore their names. Yet in every army of the Second World War, the men who decided the fate of tank battles were not gunners or commanders. They were mechanics. Hidden behind the front, ankle-deep in mud and oil, they fought a quieter war, against rust, against fatigue, against time itself. A tank without fuel is not a weapon. It is a monument. A tank with a broken track is not a machine. It is a coffin. Beneath the thunder of artillery and the roar of engines, the true struggle was fought with wrenches and grease, with hands blistered from cold metal and nights spent under leaking hulls. In this war of industry, survival was mechanical long before it was moral. For every armored column that advanced across Europe, hundreds of fuel trucks crawled behind it. Thousands of drums, hoses, and spare parts formed the arteries of war. A single day's offensive by one armored division required more than 150,000 liters of fuel, enough to drain an entire town's supply. The Allies understood this arithmetic early. Their tanks were not isolated predators, but organs in a vast living system. Each movement depended on an invisible chain of laborers, drivers, and engineers working without pause. When a Sherman broke down, it was rarely abandoned. Within hours, recovery vehicles dragged it back to a mobile depot. Mechanics worked under bombardment, patching bullet holes with salvaged metal, replacing engines in the open air. Some Shermans were repaired 5, even 6 times, returning to battle under new crews, their hulls scarred, but alive. This rhythm, damage, repair, return, turned machines into veterans of their own kind. German armor lived differently. It moved like a predator, fast and alone. The Tiger and Panther were magnificent on paper, but they hunted without a herd. Each relied on complex components that no field mechanic could easily replace. Fuel shortages crippled their reach. Spare parts existed only in theory. When the oil convoys stopped, entire units ground to a halt. Tanks became bunkers. Bunkers became graves. The myth of the lone supertank, of mechanical supremacy through isolation, died quietly in fields it could not leave. The Soviet system embraced the opposite. In endless columns stretching east to west, engineers rode with the tanks. They cannibalized damaged vehicles, stripped engines by torchlight, welded armor plates in the snow. Their improvisation was brutal but effective. When a T-34 failed, it was reborn from the pieces of another. This recycling of war, cold and pragmatic, embodied the Soviet spirit. Nothing wasted, nothing sacred, everything sacrificed for momentum. By 1944, logistics, not firepower, had become the real battlefield. The armies that could move could win. The ones that could not dissolved. The Allied invasion of Normandy succeeded not through superior tanks, but through an ocean of fuel and maintenance behind them. The Red Ball Express, a lifeline of 6,000 trucks running day and night, carrying oil, ammunition, and spare engines across France. It was the bloodstream of victory. Wars are not won by miracles, but by maintenance. The men who repaired engines under fire, who kept fuel flowing through shattered roads, carried more weight than any general's ambition. They proved a quiet truth, that machines, no matter how powerful, depend on the frail endurance of those who serve them. In the myths of war, their names were forgotten, but every tank that roared back to life owed its second breath to these invisible heroes, the ones who kept the heart of the armored war beating. And far above those muddy depots, a new kind of machine was beginning to dominate the sky, one that would render even the most perfectly maintained tank helpless beneath its shadow. The world remembers the Second World War in images of steel, tanks charging through smoke, treads biting into mud, turrets rotating like clockwork towers of power. It is easy to believe that these machines alone decided the outcome, that wars were won by armor, and that whoever built the strongest tank controlled history itself. Yet this belief, seductive and simple, conceals a harder truth. The tank was never the ultimate weapon. It was one organ in a vast, fragile body, a single instrument in an orchestra that only functioned when every section played in harmony. Victory in modern war was not born from thickness of armor, but from connection. Radios, logistics, and timing, these invisible threads bound the battlefield together. When they failed, even the mightiest steel collapsed into chaos. The myth of the tank war was born because tanks were visible. They filmed well. They gave motion and form to a war otherwise defined by uncertainty. But behind each tank that advanced, there were thousands of unseen hands. Signal operators, map makers, truck drivers, and mechanics, whose labor made that single image possible. Blitzkrieg itself, often celebrated as the triumph of armored warfare, was never truly about tanks. It was about coordination. In 1940, when German divisions swept through France, fewer than 10% of their vehicles were tanks. What made the difference was not the number of panzers, but the way they moved, guided by radio, synchronized with dive bombers, and followed by infantry trucks that could exploit the breach. It was communication supremacy, not mechanical supremacy. The radio was as decisive as the cannon. The Allies learned this lesson the hard way. In the early years of the war, French tanks were often superior to German ones in both armor and firepower, but they fought blind, each commander isolated, without real-time communication or support. Their strength was technical, their weakness systemic. The Germans fought as one organism, their opponents as scattered limbs. It was not until the Allies embraced the full integration of air, armor, and infantry, from El Alamein to Normandy, that the balance shifted. By 1944, the tank had become part of something greater, the combined arms system. Artillery softened defenses, aircraft hunted enemy armor, engineers built bridges within hours, and radio networks tied every movement together. Tanks led assaults not as champions, but as collaborators. The true weapon of victory was organization, the ability to keep this vast machinery synchronized under pressure. Even the most famous tank battles, like Kursk, were never pure contests of armor. Beneath the thunder of engines lay a subtler struggle: supply, intelligence, weather, and terrain. Soviet success at Kursk owed as much to reconnaissance and field fortifications as it did to the T-34. German defeat was not mechanical, it was logistical. Their tanks reached the battlefield already exhausted, their fuel lines stretched thin, their air support crippled by shortages. The myth of the decisive tank obscures what history records with quiet precision. Wars are lost in ledgers long before they are lost in fields. In the end, tanks offered an illusion of dominance because they were tangible. Soldiers could touch them, civilians could see them. They looked like power made real, but the true engines of victory were invisible. The planners who scheduled convoys to the hour, the signalers who kept divisions linked through static, the mathematicians who plotted fuel consumption by the minute. The tank symbolized control, yet the war proved that control itself was fleeting, dependent on systems too vast for any one weapon to command. And as the guns fell silent in 1945, a new silence began to spread, one filled not with the roar of engines, but the hum of radar, the whisper of jet turbines, and the realization that steel on the ground would never again define supremacy in war. By the summer of 1944, Europe had become a laboratory of competing philosophies, the ultimate test of what a tank and an army was meant to be. On one side stood Germany, still clinging to its creed of mechanical superiority, the Tiger and the Panther, embodiments of precision, power, and pride. On the other, the Allies, with their columns of M4 Shermans, ordinary, replaceable, and relentlessly numerous. When the landings began on June 6th, the beaches of Normandy were not designed for tanks. Sand swallowed tracks, seawater corroded engines. The first Shermans rolled off their landing craft into chaos. Artillery, smoke, and broken steel. Many never reached the dunes. German guns, hidden in concrete bunkers, tore through the first waves with mathematical efficiency. To observers, it seemed a slaughter. Yet as the tide receded and the hours passed, the pattern emerged. Even as one Sherman burned, another arrived to take its place. The front, inch by inch, moved forward. In the hedgerows beyond the beaches, the two philosophies collided head-on. The Panther, sleek, deadly, and over-engineered, excelled in ambush. Its long 75mm gun could destroy a Sherman at 1/500 meters. The Sherman, by contrast, often had to close to within 500 meters to strike back. But what the Panther had in lethality, it lacked in stamina. Its transmissions failed under the strain of constant movement. Its engines overheated in the dense summer heat. When fuel convoys were cut by Allied aircraft, entire companies were stranded, their great machines silenced by logistics. The Allies learned quickly. They adapted their tactics to the terrain, using infantry and artillery to flush out German tanks before sending their own forward. Air reconnaissance marked targets for the Typhoon and the P-47, whose rockets could destroy in seconds what took months to build. For every Panther that emerged from the trees, Allied coordination answered with an orchestra of response: tank, plane, and artillery bound together by radio and supply. By late July, the balance had shifted irreversibly. German tank losses mounted faster than replacements could arrive. In the factories of Kassel and Hanover, bombed nightly, production slowed to a trickle. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, American assembly lines delivered hundreds of new Shermans each week. It was a rhythm that no battlefield brilliance could outfight. For every German tank destroyed, 3 more Allied vehicles arrived, fueled, armed, and manned. The myth of the invincible German machine dissolved in the mud of Normandy. The Tiger and Panther could win duels, but not wars. Every kilometer they advanced cost fuel they could not replace. Every breakdown became permanent. The Allies, by contrast, fought with endurance as a doctrine. Their system absorbed loss without faltering. War, once a contest of machines, had become a contest of systems, and the system that could sustain itself would prevail. By August, as the German front collapsed and Paris awaited liberation, the fields of Normandy were littered with wrecks, Tigers, Panthers, Shermans alike, rusting side by side under the summer rain. To the untrained eye, they looked equal in defeat, but their meanings were not the same. For the Germans, each wreck was irreplaceable. For the Allies, each was a moment in motion, a cost already calculated. In the ruins of Caen, an officer wrote that the battlefield no longer resembled a duel, but a factory floor, one side running out of parts, the other still in production. Normandy had revealed the truth that theory had long denied. Victory belonged not to the strongest tank, but to the army that could keep building them. And as the front advanced toward the heart of Europe, another revelation was beginning to emerge, that no amount of armor could protect against the new predator circling in the sky above. July 1943, the Russian steppe trembled beneath the weight of engines. 6,000 tanks from both sides, the greatest armored force ever assembled, converged upon a single plain. The air was thick with dust and anticipation. For the Germans, Kursk was meant to restore their legend, a decisive strike to erase the humiliation of Stalingrad and prove that technology could still dictate destiny. For the Soviets, it would become the crucible of endurance, a battle not of brilliance, but of resolve. Operation Citadel began at dawn on July 5th. As the first shells ignited the horizon, the German spearheads advanced, Tigers, Panthers, and Ferdinand tank destroyers, rolling forward in a line of mechanical perfection. Each machine was a masterpiece: precision-cut armor, long-barreled guns, gleaming optics. Yet from the moment they moved, the fatal flaw of German engineering revealed itself. The same complexity that made these tanks formidable made them fragile. Gearboxes cracked under the strain, engines overheated, and tracks snapped in the summer heat. Many broke down before firing a single shot. The Soviets had been waiting. For months, they had studied German tactics, reading the rhythm of blitzkrieg and preparing a response not of speed, but of patience. Across the Kursk salient, they dug layer after layer of defense, over 3,000 miles of trenches, minefields dense as forests, and anti-tank guns hidden beneath camouflage nets. Where the Germans expected movement, they found a wall. Every kilometer was death by exhaustion. When the Panthers finally reached the Soviet lines, their advance slowed to a crawl. Mines tore through treads, artillery shattered formations, and the dust clogged engines until the tanks themselves became their own prisoners. The Tiger's great gun roared, destroying targets at unimaginable distances. But the battlefield was too vast, the defenses too deep. Every breakthrough collapsed into attrition. Then the Soviet counterattack began. Waves of T-34s surged forward, not in elegance, but in momentum. They came in clouds of dust and smoke, their armor scorched, their crews half-trained and terrified. Yet they moved. For every one that burned, another took its place. Where the German tanks required mechanics and spare parts, the Soviet tanks required only fuel and will. It was not perfection that turned the tide, but persistence. At Prokhorovka, the largest clash of the battle, hundreds of tanks met at point-blank range, the landscape swallowed by fire and metal. Crews fought until their guns jammed, then rammed each other like iron beasts. When the smoke cleared, the field was unrecognizable, a graveyard of both empires. But only one side could rebuild. By mid-July, Germany's offensive had stalled completely. Hitler, hearing of Allied landings in Sicily, called off the attack. The dream of reclaiming initiative on the Eastern Front died in the dust. More than 1,500 German tanks had been lost, many to breakdowns, not bullets. What was meant to be a display of technological dominance ended as a demonstration of futility. The tiger and panther, meant to symbolize superiority, had become emblems of overreach. Kursk did not merely destroy an army, it shattered an illusion. That precision alone could overcome preparation, that complexity could outlast simplicity. The T-34, born from necessity, had endured what genius could not. Its design was not elegant, but honest, built to survive, not to impress. When the smoke finally cleared, the steppe was silent but for the ticking of cooling engines, the myth of German invincibility, the belief that engineering could transcend logistics, that pride could conquer arithmetic, lay buried beneath the wreckage. Kursk was the end of an era. The battlefield of steel had proven its limits, and as both sides counted their dead, a new power was rising, one that did not roll on treads or run on fuel, but descended from the sky, changing forever what it meant to wage war. Beneath every myth was a man, cramped, sweating, afraid. The world remembers tanks as iron beasts, vast and impersonal, but inside each one beat the pulse of 5 human hearts. The roar of the engine drowned every thought. The smell of oil and cordite clung to skin and lungs. A tank, for all its metal and machinery, was a coffin that moved. The gunner's world was darkness and vibration. His sight came through a narrow lens, a flickering image framed by steel. Each shot shook the hull like a thunderclap inside a tomb. The driver lived in heat and blindness, guided only by shouted words and instinct. When the hatch slammed shut, the air thickened. When the shell struck near, the world turned white. The myth of armored glory vanished the moment the first fire spread across the floor plates. In every army, crews endured the same torment. In the Tiger and the Sherman, in the T-34 and the Panther, the conditions were nearly identical: noise, heat, and constant fear. The German gunner trusted in precision, the Soviet driver in simplicity, the American loader in speed. But all shared the same prayer, that their engine would start when it needed to, that their hatch would open if it didn't. The difference between heroism and death was often a single jammed latch. There was no romance in the work. Inside a tank, time stretched between terror and exhaustion. Crews learned to read the vibrations of their machines like heartbeats, to know when an engine was near failure, when the track had shifted by a single tooth. They slept under their tanks in the mud, ate cold rations off the armor plate, and carried photographs taped beside shell racks. To outsiders, they were machines. To each other, they were family. Morale mattered more than metal. When tanks burned, crews often kept fighting from the wreckage, switching to rifles, holding ground until reinforcements came. In Kursk, at Normandy, at El Alamein, and on the road to Berlin, victory belonged not to the tank that struck hardest, but to the crew that refused to stop. Courage was not in armor thickness, but in persistence, and yet, when the war ended, few of them became legends. The myths were written by those who never drove, never loaded, never burned. Historians spoke of horsepower and penetration, of armor angles and calibers, but rarely of the men whose fingers bled on the bolts that held those machines together. The tank became a symbol of national pride, stripped of the humanity that made it move. But history has a quieter voice, one that lives in the memories of those who returned. They spoke of comrades who sang through bombardments to stay sane, of engines repaired with scavenged parts, of the momentary calm before the next order to advance. They did not speak of victory, only survival. For them, war was not about machines or doctrines. It was about endurance, the will to move forward when everything mechanical had failed. The tank was a tool, the myth was a mask, and the truth, the real truth, was that no amount of armor could ever protect a man from what he carried within. Steel could shield flesh, but not conscience. Machinery could magnify power, but not purpose. When the war finally ended, the survivors stepped down from their vehicles and left them behind, rusting in the fields where they had once lived and nearly died. Those empty shells remain, monuments of another age, silent, cold, and still. But somewhere within that silence lingers the echo of human breath, the faint reminder that the mightiest machines were only ever as strong as the people inside them. And beyond those ruins, in the laboratories of a new century, engineers were already building weapons without men at all, unaware that in doing so, they might be stripping war of the last thing that ever made it human. When the war finally ended, Europe was silent. The fields that once thundered with engines lay scattered with steel skeletons, rusting shapes that had once defined the age. The tank, the symbol of modern power, stood broken under the same sky it once commanded. Yet as peace returned, nations began to rebuild not only their cities, but their stories. From that silence, myths rose once more, brighter, cleaner, and far easier to believe. Germany remembered its monsters. The tiger and panther became legends of lost mastery, symbols of engineering brilliance overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Veterans spoke of their power with reverence, the invincible machines that might have changed history if only there had been more of them, or more fuel, or more time. The myth offered comfort. Defeat could be explained not by failure, but by limitation. Pride was preserved in the idea that perfection had existed and that it had simply been outnumbered. Across the ocean, America remembered its hero. The Sherman became an emblem of endurance, of democratic strength. Its flaws faded in memory, replaced by the narrative of reliability and mass production. The very ordinariness that once frustrated its crews became its virtue. It was the tank that liberated Europe, the symbol of an industrial people whose unity had conquered tyranny. In this retelling, the logistics that truly won the war became invisible, buried beneath the more cinematic image of armor rolling through Paris to cheering crowds. In the Soviet Union, memory became monument. The T-34, cast in bronze and raised on pedestals from Berlin to Vladivostok, was transformed from a machine into a national myth, the steel embodiment of collective sacrifice. It stood for endurance, equality, and the triumph of simplicity over arrogance. Yet few monuments mentioned the cost, the crews who burned alive inside, the factories run by starving workers, the cold arithmetic of production that measured lives in tanks per day. The myth demanded pride, not pain. The truth, the real truth, survived only in the quiet places, in maintenance logs written in grease-stained notebooks, in wreckage half buried beneath wildflowers, in the fading recollections of the men who had lived inside those machines. Their memories did not match the propaganda. They spoke not of glory, but of exhaustion, of nights spent repairing engines under fire, of the claustrophobic heat, of the smell of burning fuel that never left their skin. For them, the war of tanks was not heroic, it was mechanical, endless, and deeply human. But history prefers simplicity. Complexity dies easily in textbooks. Nations need symbols, stories that make suffering meaningful. And so, the great armored myths took root, polished by time until they gleamed once more. Each country remembered not how the war was fought, but how it wished to have fought it. Machines became memory, myths became monuments. Yet beneath every myth lay the same irony, that the tank, once hailed as the master of the battlefield, had already begun its decline. Even as the wrecks cooled in the fields of Europe, engineers were looking upward toward the sky. A new weapon had emerged, faster, lighter, and untouched by terrain. And in that new world of air power and atomic fire, the age of the tank, and of the men who lived within it, was drawing to a quiet, inevitable close. When the guns of 1945 fell silent, the world did not abandon the tank. It rebuilt it. Across continents still scarred by fire, new armies rose from the ashes, each convinced they had understood the lessons of the last great war. Yet few truly had. The tank had become more than a weapon. It was now a symbol of power, prestige, and permanence. And like all symbols, it endured not because it was right, but because it was remembered. From the ruins of Europe came a new generation of armor. Britain's Centurion, the Soviet T-54 and T-55, America's M48 Patton, each born from the blueprints of 1945, each designed to fight the war that had already ended. Engineers studied the Tiger, the Sherman, and the T-34 like sacred texts, believing their steel descendants could perfect what history had left unfinished. The arms race that followed was less a march toward innovation than a pilgrimage to the past. The Cold War turned tanks into politics. On both sides of the Iron Curtain, parades replaced battlefields. Columns of armor rolled through city squares, not to fight, but to promise safety, dominance, and the illusion of control. The myth of the invincible tank, the same dream that had burned in the mud of Kursk and Normandy, found new life in the doctrine of deterrence. If one side could build enough armor, perhaps it would never need to use it. But the battlefield had changed while the myth had not. In Korea, mountains and mud humbled the new machines. In the Middle East, mobility often mattered more than armor. Then came Vietnam, a war of jungle and guerrilla, where tanks bogged down in swamps and narrow trails. The weapon that once symbolized momentum became an anchor. Helicopters, air power, and missiles took the stage. The tank, once the conqueror of Europe, found itself out of place, a relic of a war that no longer existed. Still, nations persisted. In the deserts of the Middle East, in the plains of Central Europe, divisions of tanks waited for the war that never came. When they did fight, in the Arab-Israeli wars, in Iran and Iraq, in Afghanistan, the results were always the same. Technology without understanding could not replace discipline, morale, or purpose. Soviet armor burned in Afghan valleys, not because it was weak, but because it was misplaced. American tanks rolled through Iraq with overwhelming force, only to discover that victory on the map did not equal peace in the streets. Each new design, heavier armor, larger guns, more complex electronics, tried to answer the same unspoken question: how to make war controllable. But war was never controllable, and the tank, despite its evolution, could not make it so. Beneath the glossy paint of each new model lay the same old illusion, that power could be measured in millimeters of steel or in the depth of a crater left behind. By the end of the 20th century, the tank had become both indispensable and obsolete, too useful to abandon, too symbolic to question. Nations still paraded them before crowds, but the men inside knew better. They knew what the generations before had learned at Kursk, at Normandy, and in the snows of the Ardennes, that no machine could carry the weight of human arrogance forever. The Cold War ended without the great armored clash everyone had prepared for. The Centurion never met the T-55 in the plains of Europe. The Patton never faced the Soviet horde. The myths endured, but the war they were built for, these never came. And so the tank lived on, not as a lesson, but as a legacy, a monument to faith in metal, to the belief that progress could be measured in armor thickness. The world had outgrown the myth, yet could not let it go. But far beyond the parade grounds, in secret laboratories and test ranges, a new generation of weapons was being born, silent, unmanned, and cold, inheriting not wisdom, but the same mistake, the belief that technology could replace understanding. The story of the tank has never truly been about machines. It has been about belief, about humanity's stubborn conviction that chaos can be controlled, that with enough steel and calculation, war can be made orderly. We built tanks to master destruction, to give form to power. Yet inside those armored shells, we discovered something older, more fragile, and more enduring. Ourselves. Every myth began as pride. The Tiger, the Sherman, the T-34. Each was born from the same human desire to build something invincible. And yet every one of them broke. Some failed in the cold, others in the heat. All failed in the hands of fear, fatigue, and imperfection. The strongest tanks were not the ones with the thickest armor, but the ones that endured failure and kept moving. The machines whose value came not from perfection, but from persistence. The myth of invincibility died with each burnt-out hull left in the mud. Beneath every turret lay evidence of the same truth, that war cannot be engineered into submission. It must be endured, suffered, and learned from, at terrible cost. For all its noise and might, the tank was still a vessel for human frailty. It carried not only shells and fuel, but hope, exhaustion, and illusion. The Tiger's story is one of arrogance, a weapon so perfect it destroyed itself. The Sherman's one of humility, flawed, simple, and repairable. The T-34's one of endurance, built to survive, not to impress. Together they tell a single story, that technology without understanding is vanity, and that the line between brilliance and blindness is measured in pride. In the end, tanks did not conquer the world. They revealed it. They showed how every civilization, no matter its strength, seeks certainty in steel, and how every generation mistakes progress for wisdom. The tank became our reflection, disciplined, powerful, yet forever flawed. When we look at the rusted carcasses still scattered across Europe, they no longer speak of victory or defeat. They speak of lessons unlearned, of engineers who dreamed of perfection, of soldiers who fought within the limits of human endurance, and of societies that believed their machines could make them immortal. The wrecks whisper a quieter story, that the real armor of history is humility, forged not in triumph, but in the wreckage of arrogance. The tank's journey, from the muddy trenches of the Somme to the deserts of Iraq, is the story of our century, an age that mistook complexity for control. We built machines to protect us from chaos, and in doing so, we carried chaos wherever we went. The truth beneath the tracks is not mechanical, it is moral. It reminds us that strength without restraint leads to ruin, and that every innovation carries the shadow of its own undoing. They built tanks to conquer the world. In the end, the truth conquered them.